when you take an evolutionary view, the right question is, in what situation is this emotion useful? Because it's not to serve one function, it's to serve many functions. And once you ask it that way, you realize that this whole attempt to find certain number of basic emotions is misguided because emotions are specialized states that are useful in certain situations that have recurred over evolutionary history.
You have found the Thinking Mind podcast.
Welcome back to the Thinking Mind podcast. Today it's Alex and we're in conversation with Dr. Randolph Nesse. Dr. Nesse is an evolutionary psychiatrist. He's one of the founders of his field, and his work has revolutionized our understanding of how evolution shapes our physical and mental health. He's a Professor Emeritus at the Department of Psychiatry and Psychology at the University of Michigan. He was previously a research professor of life sciences and founding director at the Center for Evolution and Medicine at Arizona State, and he's the founding president of the International Society for Evolution, Medicine and Public Health. He's the author of several groundbreaking books, including Why We Get Sick and Good Reasons for Bad Feelings, which have made complex scientific concepts accessible to a wide audience. In today's episode, we discuss how natural selection has shaped our psychology, the evolutionary rationale underlying things like anxiety and low mood, Dr. Nesse's concept of social traps and the smoke detector principle. We discuss what a full psychiatric assessment should look like, how depression is not all one condition, why we have emotions, why men die earlier than women, why the body is not a machine, and why you should be careful before considering a weight loss drug like Ozempic. This is the Thinking Mind podcast, a podcast all about mental health, psychology, self-development, and related topics. You may have noticed that we've increased the frequency of our episodes. This is because we want to spend some time focusing on the podcast and making it as good as it can be and giving you the best possible content. So you can now expect a new episode every Tuesday and Friday. In exchange, we need your support. You can support the podcast by following on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you listen, giving us a rating, sharing with a friend, or if you want to support us even further, you can check out the Buy Me a Coffee link in the description. I basically run on coffee alone at this point, so we'd really appreciate it. And now here's today's conversation with Dr. Randolph Nesse. Dr. Nesse, thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Thanks for the invitation, Alex. I look forward to talking.
Something that was starkly absent, I think, in my psychiatric training, and something that you have a lot of expertise in, is taking an evolutionary approach to psychiatry. And it seemed, when we were learning about all the difficulties people encounter, whether they have a diagnosed mental health condition or not, it was really obvious that we weren't talking about how things seem to function under normal circumstances, and why certain things came about. Why do people have emotional systems, for instance, or why do people have cognitive systems? I remember when we were studying kidney disease in medical school, before we studied kidney disease or kidney pathology, we first learned about how the kidney worked under normal conditions and why we had a kidney. We didn't do that in psychiatry at all. And it seems like an evolutionary approach is really fundamental to help us understand these things and really to help us to help people in a more sophisticated way. How did you're one of the founders of the field of evolutionary psychiatry. How did you find yourself going along this path?
So it sounds like we have had a similar path. I mean, I was very frustrated as a junior faculty member at the University of Michigan because all of my friends were either becoming psychoanalysts or behavior therapists or psychopharmacologists or neuroscientists, and they were all looking for what caused the problem in this individual person. And I kept saying, well, how does the whole system work in the first place? And just as you were saying, Alex, we understand disease in terms of normal function. And when you ask about, so what's normal about anxiety, everybody gives you a blank look. And there was even, I worked very hard back with my first Kaplan SADOC textbook to look up normal. And back then, there was a chapter about normal, and it was 1.5 pages. The subsequent editions eliminated it, and everything, is about pathology. So that made me decide, hey, I really need to do something to find a better foundation. So I went to the Museum of Natural History in the Department of Biology at Michigan and to talk with people who studied animal behavior. And it just completely opened my eyes because they have a whole separate additional kind of explanation for behavior, not just how it works, not just how the brain works and how the psychology works, but why the system is the way it is. And that led me to my first article in 1984 about, an evolutionary foundation for psychiatry. And it was immediately clear that no one would pay any attention to a psychiatrist talking about evolution. Plus, there were a lot of missing pieces. If we were going to understand why natural selection left us vulnerable to mental disorders, the first question is, why does it leave us vulnerable to any disorder? So that led to collaboration with George Williams and spending 25 years and continuing to try to bring evolution to medicine more generally. And it's been a wonderful journey.
Mm-hmm. So that might be a good place to start. And you wrote a book about this called Why We Get Sick. Why do we develop disorders?
Right. So let's pause just for a moment and note just how different this question is. A lot of scientists have said, hey, scientific changes and revolutions really come mainly from not just gathering new data, they come from asking new questions. All through medicine, we ask, how does it work? What's broken and how can we fix it? That's very much of a mechanics view of disease. But if you take an evolutionary view, you ask this additional question, more of an engineering view of who the heck designed this thing? And why didn't they do a better job? And you're a psychiatrist. I'm sure you look out your window sometimes. We do what we can for as many people as we can possibly help, and it will never be enough. I mean, the burden and the suffering out there from emotional disorders and attention disorders and more severe disorders as well. I mean, we're never going to be able to offer, great treatment individually for everybody. We need to also ask this question about, so why are we all vulnerable? And it turns out that George Williams and I, wonderful biologist, who's the real co-founder of evolutionary medicine, we came up with several categories. The first is, hey, natural selection just can't do some things. Mutations happen. It can't find all good solutions. There's some stochasticity in development. So that's an important one. But when I was in medical school, that was the only explanation. People said, oh, Dr. Nesse, don't you know that natural selection isn't that great? Of course, the body is vulnerable. But then there are several others. But should I just go on with them? Or do you want to comment on anything before we go forward?
What I seem to think, I can tell you what I think, and you tell me how you feel about it. When it comes to a lot of aspects of our mental health, what it seems to me that's happening is you can't have a strength without a corresponding weakness. So I talk about personality. I like talking about personality theory a lot, like the Big Five personality. And one thing I've discovered in learning about it is that every personality trait is kind of a strength and a weakness at the same time. So take extroversion, for instance. If you're extroverted, you're really good at making new social relationships quickly, and that's kind of the upside. But then the downside is those relationships tend to be quite superficial, and you're not so good at depth, which introverts are good at depth, and you're not so good at being on your own. So there aren't really any clear, definite solutions. Every solution comes with a dark side.
And what you put your finger on is one of the main explanations evolution offers for why we're vulnerable to disease. It's called trade-offs. I mean, just everything, whether it's designed by an engineer or shaped by natural selection, you get one thing better, another thing's going to be worse. If you want to build the fastest race car, it has to be very, very light. And very, very light race cars are very prone to break. In the body, you want a really strong immune system, right? Because you don't want to die of an infection. And natural selection indeed is shaped a very strong immune system. But the price of that is autoimmune diseases and inflammatory diseases. And you'd think there'd be some point in the middle where you just had the perfect amount where you didn't get any infectious disease and didn't get any immune diseases. Not possible. Natural selection optimizes it. So that's a whole other explanation. And I'm launching into the other possible links. Another one is arms races. Natural selection is slow. and it can't possibly keep up with fast evolving pathogens. That's especially relevant for OCD, which we could talk about later. And then more generally, natural selection is too slow to keep us up with rapidly changing environments. This is usually called mismatch. And make rounds in any hospital in the UK and look at the people in those beds. Half of them are there because of modern diseases, because of living in an abnormal environment. Obesity and hypertension, breast cancer is far, far more common in modern environments than it used to be. So I think that's overemphasized in psychiatry, actually. But then there's the really biggest one of all. The whole system is not shaped by natural selection for health, longevity, happiness, cooperation. It's only shaped to maximize gene transmission. And as a result, we humans, along with every other animal, we tend to behave doing things that maximize gene transmission. And guess what proportion of problems in psychiatry have to do with sexual impulses and all the rest? I mean, it's a huge issue.
Yeah.
And there's an easy explanation for why such things are so important.
So are we not even optimized for longevity in the service of passing on our genes?
Oh, what a wonderful question. That is how I got into evolution and medicine in the first place, Alex. As an undergraduate, I came up with this idea that I thought maybe aging would be good for the species, because if some individuals died every single year, the species would evolve faster. And my professor as an undergraduate thought that was a brilliant idea. And so when I was first talking with these biologists in Michigan, when I was in the faculty, junior faculty member in psychiatry, I floated this idea with them, and they all looked around and they all got quiet, and then some of them started laughing. And it turns out that that's a completely wrong idea from an evolutionary viewpoint. They essentially said, wait, don't you doctors learn biology? I said, yes, I've studied biology for years. They said, no, but you've only learned half of biology. Don't you know that natural selection does not shape traits to maximize anything for the species? It only maximizes individuals' reproduction. And they said, go read Williams, 1957. And that's his brilliant paper that explains why there is aging. I mean, part of it is that that genes drop in and I can't be selected out because everybody in a species is already dead by a certain age. But the more profound explanation has a technical name of antagonistic pleiotropy. All that means is a gene that does two different things that are antagonistic and have multiple effects. But what if a gene causes coronary artery calcification, and which will gradually kill everybody by age 150? But what if that same gene makes you more vigorous early in life? That gene is going to be selected for, George Williams said, because selection is so much stronger when more individuals are alive at earlier ages. And that idea completely transformed the study of aging and gerontology and led to my first papers on evolution. I wrote several papers using data from wild animals to confirm George Williams's theory. And that led to my collaboration with him and us working together to try to figure out why does natural selection leave us vulnerable to disease more generally.
Mm-hmm. So ultimately, longevity will always be subservient to ultimately the transmission of genes when the adults, the young, vibrant adults of the species are vibrant, healthy, and able to reproduce.
That's right. And there are lots of experimental work that can confirm this. I mean, if you breed fruit flies for longevity, they actually have lower reproduction. And if you breed them for early and fast reproduction, they end up later generations having shorter lifespans. So there's all kinds of data that supports this. And it's practically important too. I mean, now that we're doing genome-wide sequencing, we can find specific loci that are related to longer lifespan and shorter lifespan. Would it be good, for instance, to just somehow do genetic engineering and eliminate those genes that seem to cause shorter lifespan?
Well, we don't know.
Almost certain. Well, it would come at a price.
Yeah.
It would come at a price. And now we're back to your principle of trade-offs that you were mentioning before. Big trade-offs for faster or slower aging.
So I'm trying to get into the heads of my listeners, and they might be thinking, but what about something common that clearly is a negative thing, something like sadness or anxiety or paranoia. What could be, why on earth would that be useful, and why would nature bestow that upon us?
Right. I'm so glad you phrased it that way, Alex, because there's a big mistake that a lot of beginners make about evolutionary psychiatry, and that is to assume that diseases are useful. I'm just going to emphasize because it's so important. Diseases are not useful. They're not shaped by natural selection. And it's a mistake to ask, how is schizophrenia useful? But it's not a mistake to ask how emotions are useful, because we all have emotions. Animals have emotions too, and there must be good reasons how they give us selective advantage. And it's not too hard, really. Um, Individuals that have a capacity to go into a special state of activation or avoidance or one thing or another in certain situations, they get an advantage. If in fact there's a lion staring at you and breathing hard, and your reaction is an experience of awe, what a beautiful cat, those genes are going to go away very quickly. But if in fact your reaction is terror and breathing fast and running fast and your heart pounding fast, you're much more likely to survive and pass on more genes. And, I spent much of my career, most of it really, helping to develop the Anxiety Disorders Clinic at the University of Michigan. And this insight finally made me realize I was treating fight-flight responses, panic attacks, and I'd never really understood what they were until I took an evolutionary perspective. And more important, I didn't understand how natural selection had shaped the mechanism that regulates when panic responses are expressed. And that really transformed my clinical practice.
So maybe you can take us through a panic attack. What's happening when someone's having a panic attack? Let's say they get in an elevator and they're a bit claustrophobic. What's going on there?
So it's a point-specific response, almost a fixed action pattern, as the ethologists call it, where your heart starts pounding and you start breathing fast and your skin turns white and you have this overwhelming feeling of, I've got to get out of here. And often you feel like you're going crazy because you can't think about anything except getting out of there. Your muscles start trembling. And my patients, in the first part of my career, they would say, why is all this happening? I'd say, well, it's your adrenaline. It's your sympathetic nervous system is doing all this. So that's what's called the proximate or mechanical explanation. But once I started thinking in evolutionary terms, I was able to offer a much better explanation for them. I was able to say, listen, these things would be useful if you were faced with a wild animal or in some very dangerous situation. At least some of them would be useful. And that transformed my patients' understanding of their own symptoms. Because previously they said, oh my gosh, I'm a defective person. I should quit my muscles trembling. I should quit breathing so fast. I should quit. And now they said, oh, so there are advantages as well as disadvantages to these symptoms. And if I have these in the right circumstance, it can be very useful.
And in this realm, you came up with the idea of the smoke detector principle. And maybe you could take us through that.
Yes, I'd love to talk about it. That was later, actually.
Yeah.
I was treating panic patients and I already had this new intervention where I began talking to my patients about how many aspects of it were useful. And we did lots of behavior therapy, taking patients to grocery stores and the like. And I was fascinated. I'm sure you are also, if you do behavior therapy. Even after the fifth time in the grocery store, people still are very anxious going in and they still are likely to have panic attacks. And I was tempted to say, what's wrong with you? I mean, you haven't had anything bad happen for the last 5 times. I never said that, of course.
Yeah.
But I kept thinking, why is it that this system doesn't adapt? The person should know perfectly well. First principle is that the conscious mind is a pretty weak thing compared with these underlying mechanisms that actually set off the anxiety and the like. But then I started using what's called signal detection theory, a theory actually that was created by Swetson Green back in 1966 at the University of Michigan. And it's become seminal for electrical engineers and scientists of all kinds who ask questions like, is that click coming across a telephone line a real click, or is it just static?
Is it signal or noise?
It's actually right. And for stereo, you look at the signal to noise ratio to try to figure out how good your stereo system is. And so I started delving into that. And of course, how do you tell if something is a click or noise? Well, you have to figure out what the likelihood is, what's the ratio of signals to noises, but you also have to figure out what's the cost of making a mistake and saying, oh, it's just noise when it actually is a click,
Yeah.
or making the other kind of mistake and saying, well, it's actually a click, but maybe it's not. This is so important. I mean, how about those guys who watch radar to see if somebody might be sending missiles across the North Pole to the USA, right? Um, if they make a mistake and say it's missiles and they launch other missiles in response, that's the end of the world. That's a disaster. So you want to be really, really careful in that kind of situation, not to say that it's missiles. But what happens if you are at an African watering hole with just your wooden spear trying to get water for your family, and you hear a noise behind a rock? It could be a lion, or it could be nothing, just some smaller animal. Should you run away? And it turns out that natural selection has shaped a very sophisticated mechanism for making those decisions. You intuitively assess how common are lions around here. Is it likely to be a lion or not? And then you ask yourself, how loud is the noise? You don't do this consciously. But if it's just a small noise like, then you figure, that's not a lion. But if it's louder noise, that's a lion. You better run. But what if it's in between? What if it's, should you run? So to figure that out, you need to know the cost of a false alarm. That's about 100 calories. Or the cost of not running away if it's really a lion, and we'll just assume he's fast and you're slow and he's hungry, in which case it's about 100,000 calories.
It's the ultimate cost.
The ultimate cost. And this means, what's the ratio? The ratio is 100 to 100,000. It's 1,000 to 1. So that means, so when I first did the calculation, Alex, I couldn't believe it. That meant that it would be optimal to flee if the probability of a lion being there was anything greater than 1 in 1,000. And that meant that it's optimal to have 999 panic attacks for every time you really flee from a lion. And all of a sudden, I realized that my patients, weren't just making mistakes. The mechanism is designed to have normal false alarms, just like the smoke alarms in our houses. We all put up with smoke alarms from burnt toast because we want to be absolutely sure that even a small real fire will get us out of the house safely.
Yeah, it's so interesting. We're constantly trying to establish the nature of our immediate reality, and what people don't know is there's basically two kinds of errors we can make, which are the errors you highlighted. We can think that there's a pattern there where there is no pattern. We can look up at the night sky and think those are gods, or those are the windows into heaven. Or we can think there is no pattern here, there's nothing causing the bushes to rustle, whereas actually there is a pattern, there is a cause and effect, there's a hungry lion.
So I would like to come back to this idea about seeing patterns later when we talk about schizophrenia and psychosis, because that's especially relevant there. I wanted to mention that my work with Isaac Marks, who was at the Maudsley, and I spent several weeks living with him, working on a paper called Fear and Fitness. I think it came out in 1990. And we came up with another very interesting idea when we worked on that paper. We realized that for every response the body has, whether it's vomiting or cough or fear, there can be too little as well as too much. And so we coined the term hypophobia. That just means not enough anxiety. Now, people do not come to a psychiatrist saying, Dr. Nesse, I don't have enough anxiety. Could you please help me? But they should, because hypophobia is potentially fatal. And it's just, there's so many people who drive recklessly and live recklessly, and you don't find them lining up for psychiatric treatment, but you do find them in unemployment lines and in jail and in the morgue. It's a very serious disorder that we don't do anything.
It's like how some people have cripplingly low self-esteem, and that can be bad, but some people have a really overinflated sense of themselves, and that can be really bad. But people almost never come to therapy because they feel too grandiose about themselves, but they'll come to therapy later in their life when as a result of feeling too good about themselves, their life is like collapsing around them and they become depressed.
Right? Other people complain about them.
Yeah.
But I don't know if you've noticed, but a lot of people who are kind of grandiose seem to do pretty well, especially in modern society. They can convince other people that they are really hot stuff and that leads to better positions and all. I think there's a general bias for most people to have slightly, overly positive views of themselves and the world.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a good thing. And these psychoanalysts used to call that normal narcissism. And I think that's useful because it keeps you doing things and it makes other people have a more positive view of you. But boy, it's dangerous if it spirals out of control.
Yeah, when it spirals out of control, the pattern I see is that someone who's really grandiose, there's a meteoric rise followed by a sudden precipitous fall. They can gather a lot of momentum and have a lot of success very quickly, and then everything starts to unravel. Like you see that a lot in crime movies where people will use whatever means they want to attain success, and then you have
Right.
this very short-lived, fragile empire.
But this is all bringing us around to the evolution of the capacity for mood, high mood and low mood.
Yeah, let's talk about
And
mood.
anxiety is pretty easy to understand because, hey, it's good to get out of dangerous situations and to learn to avoid them. But at first glance, sadness and low mood and depression, it really doesn't seem like there's anything good about those states. However, if you think about it for just a few minutes, are there situations in which it's best to conserve energy, to be pessimistic, to not do much of anything? And the answer is sure. There are lots of situations in which whatever you do is going to be wasted. And worse yet, in social competitions, if you've just lost a battle with someone who's more powerful and you just keep on fighting, you're going to get beat up worse and worse and worse, either physically or socially. John Price was a brilliant evolutionary psychiatrist who really got things going in the UK. He was first inspired by looking at his chickens in his chicken coop. And he noticed that they have this pecking order, a hierarchy of status in chickens. And he noticed that after one had lost a pecking order battle, it tended to go away to a corner of the coop and not fight anybody and just avoid further fighting. And he noticed that if they didn't keep trying to fight, they really got pecked very badly by the ones that were higher, stronger, and higher status. And he coined the term involuntary yielding. So involuntary yielding is his idea that, perceiving that you can't really fight and that you're relatively helpless is useful after you've lost a social status battle. Another psychologist in the UK, Paul Gilbert, has elaborated on this very wonderfully. He has written many books about this. So it's a very potent explanation that I find useful in my practice.
So is that why someone's testosterone, like a man's testosterone, will go down after they've lost a fight? If I'm not mistaken, is that why?
Yeah, I've looked into that research and I'm not sure how consistent that finding is for humans. Michael McGuire did work on this in the Sepulveda Veterans Hospital in the United States using monkeys. And he did an experiment which was kind of cruel. I don't think it would be allowed these days, but it was very profound as well. In the monkeys he was studying, there's usually a hierarchy with one male having multiple females, and the other monkeys are beta males. And what he did is simply take the alpha male out of the cage and put him in an adjacent cage where he could watch as the beta males took over the females. And first they were very upset, and then they just sort of huddled and cowered and rocked, looking every bit like somebody who has severe depression. They did some work on serotonin in those monkeys, which probably was not accurate, so that didn't work. But they also found that if they gave drugs to those monkeys that made them continue to fight and be less suppressed, they didn't do well. In fact, we could even talk about the test that's used to find new drugs for depression. It's called the Porsalt test. And really, it's again kind of a mean thing, but it's the main way that you test for drugs that might be good antidepressants. You take a rat and put it in a beaker of water and see how long it swims. You give some rats something like you get an antidepressant, and you give some of them a placebo. And if the drug makes the rats swim longer, it's likely to be a good antidepressant. So this comes back to the helplessness theory of Seligman, and the idea that learned helplessness, that we learn to be helpless when we've had failures, and it's not really good learning. And our job as therapists is to convince people that they're not really so helpless, which is a very useful kind of intervention. But the Pourcelt test kind of assumes that stopping swimming is a bad thing.
Just like we assume with depression that all low mood is a bad thing.
That's right. But do those rats drown when they stop swimming? No, they rest and they float with just their nose above the water. And in the wild, the rats who have an antidepressant on board and struggle, even though there's no way to get onto land, they drown faster. So it's a very dramatic illustration of how we've been thinking in naive ways. It seems obvious that struggling and swimming is a good thing, but it depends on the situation. It's good at first if there's land nearby or if there's an opportunity to get out of the water. But if you're being swept away in a flood, it's best just to float and wait.
Yeah, I also think there's a lot of useful psychological utility to sadness, aside from sadness preventing you from doing behaviors which might be counterproductive or at least not useful. Sadness is useful because it helps you to go over something that you've lost. It helps you to take a bit of a mental inventory, take stock of a bad thing that's happened, helps you reorganize your values. And I guess when it's at its healthiest, helps you change your thinking so that the same thing might not happen in the future.
I think those are all profound things, Alex. And it's useful for people who are experiencing sadness after a loss to educate them and have them say, no, you shouldn't just fight your sadness. Sadness is there for a good reason. It will pass. And it's also helpful to educate them that sadness and depression are two different things. I mean, sadness is after a loss. Losses happen to all of us always in life. And we feel sad for a while, and we try to figure out why it happened, as you say, and try to prevent it from happening again. But depression, and I call it low mood to make clear it's not always abnormal, I mean, that's when we're striving, putting energy into trying to accomplish something, but failing. And then there's a whole series of reactions that go on. So we conserve our energy. So we look and see if there's a better strategy. And if nothing works at all, we give up on that goal and move on to something else. Eric Klinger wrote a brilliant article, several articles in 1975 that every psychiatrist should read, where he talked about the origins of low mood and how it can be useful. A lot of people have followed up with that. Carsten Roche has done work on this, looking with parents of cancer patients. And Jutta Heckhausen has done some of the most dramatic studies on women who are approaching menopause who want to have a child. There's a pursuit of an unreachable goal, right? Some of them were successful, but others, as they got closer and closer to menopause, were more and more upset that they weren't going to reach their goal, more and more upset. And then after menopause, and after it was really clear that they would not be able to have children, most of them changed their attitude dramatically, and their depression went away. Instead of saying, "Oh my God, what am I going to do?" They started turning their energies to other ways that they could be with children and help. But most of all, they talked to themselves and they said, "Why did I ever want that? Children are expensive and difficult and all the rest." And normal psychological mechanisms have protected them from spending too much of their time feeling terrible about things that they don't have. More generally in life, I mean, natural selection has made us humans want things, all kinds of things, status and sex and power and money and all the rest. And none of us can ever get all the things that we want. And so there have to be built-in mechanisms there to protect us from just feeling bad all the time about things that we can't have.
It's remarkable that we don't feel worse more often, given how fragile and short our lives are, and how much there is danger. Which I guess, like you say, we have these protective mechanisms. So more often than not, we're barely even aware of all these lurking dangers. We don't think about death nearly as much as we probably should. In fact, some, like the Stoic philosophers, made a conscious practice of meditating on death just so that it would inform your life. And there are so many, movies and stories about this idea that when the protagonist is confronted with the idea of death, suddenly they, ironically or paradoxically, their life takes on a new vividness.
Yes, yes. So I had the privilege of being on a different podcast a few weeks ago. It's called the Stoa podcast, and it's about Stoicism. And that led me to freshen up what I knew about Stoicism and had a wonderful talk with the person who runs that podcast about this exact topic, about how we manage our desires. Really, each different Greek philosophy is one of how to manage desires. Hedonists, go for it. Try to go for it. Stoics try to control their desires and realize that you can't really control them, so you shouldn't let yourself become too upset about things. And then there are a lot of philosophies more in the middle of Epicurean, where you try to take pleasures that don't take you to too many extremes and the like. But there's this huge, now we're back to these trade-offs that you mentioned before, Alex, of trying to pursue goals and get things, and pursue pleasure, versus realizing that we can never completely succeed at that. And the reason we can't succeed at that is because natural selection has shaped us to continue to pursue goals, and especially goals having to do with status and money and living a long time and sex and having children.
Yeah.
It's shaped it. We can't just say, oh, those are silly things natural selection has shaped us to do, because, and this is something I've thought about just in the last couple of weeks, Alex. And isn't it fascinating that we can't control our emotions?
Mm-hmm. Not directly, at least.
It's hard, right? How can you control an emotion? There's three ways. First, you can change the situation you're in, and get out of a bad situation. Second, you can change how you think about the situation. And third, you can change the brain with drugs or other kinds of things. These are the three main methods of therapy. But the first one is the first and most useful and best one, when it's possible, is to get out of a bad situation. And I'd like to cycle back in a minute to what I call social traps. Many of our patients are in social traps. They're in a marriage. Actually, I'll talk about it now. They're in a. You see patients who are in a marriage, and they're supported by their spouse, but the spouse is having an affair and not treating them well, and they want to leave. But if they leave, then they have no income.
They lose the support.
Yeah, right. It's desperate. Or you're in a job where you just realize you're never going to get promoted, but you can't get any other job. And this is very big for graduate students, especially. You're just into your fifth year trying to get a PhD in art history when you finally realize that there are no jobs that will use your skills in that particular area. Do you stop, or do you continue for the next 2 years? It's terrible to stop in the middle of pursuing a giant goal like that that's so personally important. But continuing also makes you feel like, well, should I really be doing this? That's a dilemma that's so hard. And the normal mood mechanisms arouse when you're trying to pursue a goal that's not going to work for you, and they try to disengage your motivation. And that's the essence of low mood, is disengaging motivation, making you feel less adequate, making you feel pessimistic. And those things can be useful, but they're also usually useless.
It can be useful to a point, but then past a certain point, let's say with depression, there's another positive feedback loop that happens. You get more and more stuck, more and more paralyzed, more isolated. And then at some point, and it's hard to say when precisely, it goes into the realm of pathology. Like, I imagine you would agree that when a person becomes so depressed that they stop eating and drinking and stop getting out of bed, then we're very much in the pathological realm.
Absolutely. People keep writing these general papers about, so is depression normal or is it useless and bad?
Yeah.
And please, can we pause and try to understand together, how natural selection regulates depression? And once you do that, you come to a very different perspective. And that is, and I wrote about this in my paper that just came out in World Psychiatry, trying to put all of this together. And I came to a conclusion that was surprising to me. Previously, I think most people think, bad feelings are probably normal. If they're normal, they must be useful. That seems sensible, but it's not, because natural selection shapes the mechanism to express these bad feelings well, there are several reasons why. Here's my big conclusion. Most bad feelings are normal but useless. How can that be? They come from normal brain mechanisms. There's nothing wrong with the brain for most people who have anxiety and depression. There are patients who definitely have things wrong with their brain, but for most of us, when we have those feelings, the brain is normal. And first reason is the smoke detector principle, why you have excess low mood or excess anxiety. A second one is we're in modern environments that are very different from ancestral environments. People didn't get used to be trapped in dead-end jobs and bureaucracies.
Right.
They could wander off and find food in themselves. The third big one is that the whole system isn't designed for us. It's designed for our genes. And so people who are dead set on having children or dead set on having sex or something, you can't just decide not to want those things, but also sometimes you can't have them. And this leads to great unhappiness. So I think most bad feelings are products of normal brain mechanisms, but nonetheless, they're useless. And therefore, I think but before we go on as therapists and psychiatrists to try to help people get rid of those feelings, there's something very important that must be done first, something that all other physicians automatically do. If you come in with a cough, the doctor doesn't say, "Oh, you have cough, it's probably not necessary, let's treat your cough." The doctor says, "I want to listen to your lungs. I want to get a chest x-ray. Let's find out if there's some reason for your cough that needs treatment." And what I would love every psychiatrist to do is what I call a life situation analysis, where you actually systematically go through all of the things that people try to do in life and see how a person's doing in every area.
Personally, I found almost everyone who I've seen clinically who has low mood or anxiety has like 4 or 5 really, really good reasons.
And again, it's complicated because some of those reasons are in the past traumas or past failures. Some of them, and the worst ones, I think, are these situations where people are in social traps, where they're in a bad situation, but to get out of that situation will be very costly, either financially or emotionally. I mean, what do you do if your husband's having an affair? Do you just leave and leave all of your other friends in your house? And it's not so simple. And I think instead of saying, "Oh, just get out of the bad situation," a good therapist will listen for many, many hours to why a person is staying in a bad situation and try to help them figure out a way out of that situation. But again, I think we get a deeper understanding for people's lives with an evolutionary perspective. We conduct what I call a review of social systems. In the rest of medicine, you go to the doctor and he says, "How's your balance? How are your bowels? How is your peeing? How is your appetite? How is your weight?" They ask all kinds of general questions to see if there might be something else wrong that's causing your cough or your fatigue or whatever. In psychiatry, I think we need to do a review of social systems and go systematically through each area of life, trying to understand our patients one by one.
And do you find that's not what's happening in where you've practiced in your career?
No. I mean, people are all too often forced to have 15 minutes or 30 minutes with a patient, go through a checklist. You have enough depression symptoms to justify a diagnosis of major depression. Therefore, we're going to put you on drugs and give you CBT. I mean, it's very crude and simplistic.
Very algorithmic, but like not a sophisticated algorithm like ChatGPT, like a very unsophisticated algorithm like you put in the page of a book.
But on the other hand, invariably, I find with my patients that if there's a big problem in their lives that they haven't solved, there's a good reason why they haven't solved it. It often requires a huge transition. I remember one woman who came to me, she was very anxious in general. She was anxious about everything. And I asked about everything about her life, and her life was fine. She had a good husband, he had a good job working for the auto companies, and he was good to her, and she had kids who were growing up now. And so I went through everything seemed fine. And I said, "Well, how about you and your husband friends?" She says, "They're fine. My husband gets a lot of exercise. He plays tennis. And of course, his tennis partners, they're getting divorces." Well, that's interesting. How many tennis partners does he have? Oh, there are these 6 guys he plays with regularly. And I said, well, what about these divorces? 5 of them have divorced their wives and married younger women. I said, oh. And she got very quiet. And she says, I guess I'm worried about that. I said, yeah, I think you might be worried about that. But then we had to figure out what to do about that. She was spending a lot of effort trying to make herself attractive, trying to please her husband. She was spending so much time trying to please her husband that she was being taken advantage of somewhat. But the intervention for her was to get her on a track where she got educated to get into a career so that she knew she was not only more interesting, she was financially independent in case her husband did leave her. And that completely transformed her life. It was a much different kind of intervention than just helping her deal with her depression.
Absolutely. So there's a lot of people with these kinds of problems. There are a lot of hidden conflicts.
That's right.
Which aren't immediately obvious. Can I run a bit of neurobiology past you? So we just released a podcast with Dr. Nolan Williams from Stanford, and I'm not sure if you're familiar with some of his work, but he does a lot of brain stimulation at Stanford, very intense, aggressive forms of magnetic stimulation. And what he found is, in a subset of his patients, which he gave this treatment, there was some kind of abnormality where a part of the brain that's responsible for conflict detection, called the anterior cingulate, was coming online before another part of the brain, the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, could regulate it. So what he finds in most people, the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex comes online first, and then the anterior cingulate comes on. And what he found in depressed people is the reverse was happening. So they were detecting a lot of conflict without a part of the brain that could come in and regulate it. And what he found was, in these patients, his intense magnetic stimulation treatment reversed that pattern. And the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex was able to come online before this conflict detection mechanism could come online. So that kind of fits with what you're saying, is that depression is kind of being stuck in a conflict from which you see no clear path or solution.
Right, right. So what you just described is a mechanism. And what we evolutionists try to understand is why that mechanism is the way it is.
Yes.
And in this case, understanding the mechanism might help you to do something with magnetism that would disrupt the part of the brain that is causing the symptoms.
I mean, what was sorry to interrupt you, what was really cool about it was that his patients who had this transformation where there was this reversal, they said that not only did they become less depressed, it was more sophisticated in that they were starting to be able to see solutions where previously they only saw problems. So doing something neurobiologically seemed to shift something very important for them psychologically.
That's very exciting. Many people think that Dr. Nesse says you shouldn't take drugs or take physical treatments for your depression. Absolutely not. I mean, depression is mental pain. Depression tries to push you away from things just the way physical pain does. And just as most physical pain is excessive for the smoke detector principal reason, most mental pain is excessive and useless. And we should try to do whatever we can to relieve that pain safely. The only thing I would say is that we should first try to understand its source if we can possibly find one. And my experience has been a little different than yours. I kept records on every patient we saw in our clinic for many years, trying to understand, is this person's problem mainly because of their current situation? Is this person's problem mainly because of past experience of learning anxiety and the rest? Or is this person somebody who's just always had anxiety? It doesn't seem to have much to do with their situation. And it was about a third. I found many patients who had, their mother and their father and their sister all had way too much anxiety or depression or both. And it was just the way they were, and their excess had been useless from the very beginning. So it's useful to try to ask for each patient what's going on.
Yeah, everyone's going to have such an individual combination of different factors, and I guess that's the essence of doing a really good formulation, as you're saying, there is no, and because like as you're alluding to with all of these points, we refer to depression like it's one condition, but depression is not a condition the same way tuberculosis is one condition. Like tuberculosis is one condition because it's one cause, an infection with a specific pathogen causing a specific array of symptoms with a reasonably predictable prognosis. And depression isn't like that at all, because in psychiatry we're mostly diagnosed from clinical presentation, from the problems that they have, the surface level manifestations, rather than the etiology or the cause. So depression is more of a bucket where there's so many different parts to it.
So one of my former graduate students, Matthew Keller, took on a grandly challenging project for his PhD. He decided to ask, are the symptoms of depression the same no matter what causes it? And he had the evolutionary idea that, just like symptoms of a cold, I mean, you get a runny nose if the virus is in your nose, and you get a cough if the virus is in your trachea. Maybe there would be different symptoms of depression depending on what kind of situation is setting it off. And that's exactly what he found. He found that if the situation was due to a social loss, there was a lot of guilt and self-recrimination and lethargy. If their loss was failure to accomplish some kind of work goal, then there was a whole different suite of symptoms. And he went on to confirm this in a couple of more studies. Another student I worked with was Eiko Fried, who's taken this much further. He's the person who's talked about depression symptoms each need to be studied individually. I think this is a giant mistake he's confirmed that most research is making. We use scales where people count the number of symptoms they have and how severe they are, and we give them a score on a Hamilton scale or a Bett scale to determine whether they have depression or not. And we never look in the follow-up to see which symptoms patients have. And he's pointed out that, there's enormous data that's lost by just assuming that depression is one thing that can be summarized in a single score, that we should in fact be looking at all the symptoms and not just the symptoms that are in the DSM-3 or the symptoms on the Hamilton scale. We should look at all of them and how they're interacting with each other. He does what's called network analysis to show how symptoms are related to each other. And one profound conclusion he's come to is that the symptoms that are highlighted in a DSM for diagnosing depression, that's DSM is the standard US way of making a diagnosis of depression, they're not the ones that are most central to the network. Others are more central to the network. So again, the big picture here is to quit making simplistic generalizations about both the causes of depression and to quit assuming that depression is all one thing. And I'm going to go one step further. A lot of people have tried to find subtypes of depression and say there are different kinds of depression. But I think that's not a really evolutionary view. An evolutionary view is that natural selection has shaped these mechanisms, and they're kind of messy.
So do you think they're making the mistake of still using categories when they should be using dimensions?
It's not even as simple as that. Let's go back to the origins of emotions and how I got into really studying them in detail. I was so frustrated after spending about 10 years as a psychiatrist, realizing I'm treating emotional disorders. What are emotions for? Why do they exist?
That's the title of one of our audio essays, is what are emotions for?
Is that right?
Yeah.
So that's the question even most evolutionary types ask. And I think it's the wrong question. They do have functions, but it's so tempting because our human brains take everything, whether it's a hammer or an emotion or something, and say, what is it for? That's what we do with our human brains. But I spent a year reading about emotions, and it was just a mess. Everybody was arguing about how many basic emotions are there, and which comes first, the subjective aspect of the emotion or the physical aspects of the emotion. And then people were saying, so what is each emotion for, as if each emotion has something different. When you take an evolutionary view, you come to the conclusion that I think maybe my biggest contribution to psychiatry, the right question is, in what situation is this emotion useful? Because it's not to serve one function, it's to serve many functions. And once you ask it that way, you realize that this whole attempt to find certain number of basic emotions is misguided, because emotions are specialized states that are useful in certain situations that have recurred over evolutionary history. And if you take that perspective, you realize that since each emotion evolves from other emotions, they're all overlapping suites of changes. They're not distinctly different, but neither are they completely the same on dimensions. Actually, they've evolved from each other. I have a tree I drew one time that's gotten reprinted many times. There are two broad categories of emotions. One are negative emotions, and those are useful in the face of threat or loss. And then there's positive emotions, and those are useful in the face of gain or opportunity. And there are very few neutral emotions. Why is that? But that's because if it's not an opportunity or threat, there's no point in having a special situation for it.
And they're separate brain circuits, aren't they? And they're separate, so people are kind of separately predisposed to having either a lot or a little or somewhere in between on the positive end, and the same on the negative end.
It used to be that people measured emotions in terms of the overall positive or negative state a person's in. And it's gradually become very clear that the positive emotions are regulated to some extent in ways that are separate from the negative emotions. So you can have both at the same time. And we see that in some of our patients with manic depressive illness. They have extreme mania and they have very positive emotions and very negative emotions all at the same time.
Exactly. Let's talk about pleasure and the reward system a bit. Something that, there's a big trope in psychology and self-help that it's not about the destination,
Yes.
it's about the journey. And I think that despite the fact that that's a bit of a cliche, I think it's actually true.
Mm-hmm.
So why is it that we're more happy in pursuit of a goal than on attaining a goal?
What a profound question, Alex. This is useful to discuss with patients, I think, as well. Why do we have this enthusiasm when we're pursuing a goal? And how actually is mood regulated? Carver and Shire are brilliant psychologists who've done research on this in Florida. And they point out that mood is not, in fact, based on what you get or what you have. The mood changes based on your rate of progress towards a valued goal. And if your progress is faster than expected, you feel good. Oh, it's working out better than I thought. If it's slower than expected, even if you're still making progress, you feel low and, oh, this is going to take longer than I thought. This is worse. This might not work out. And then if progress stops, that's when things really get difficult. And as Eric Klinger pointed out, you might just at some point need to back up and consider either a different strategy or giving up the goal entirely. And just to pause here for a moment, natural selection has shaped mechanisms to deal with all of these different situations. The situation of slower progress towards a goal, faster progress towards a goal. Faster progress towards a goal is a very important situation. It means that times are good now. You should put in a lot of effort and risk and energy into pursuing your goal now because it's good times. There are other bad times, and natural selection has shaped mechanisms to decrease our energy investment and our risk taking when we're not likely to make progress towards a goal.
And this is really useful. I find this really useful in psychotherapy. So when I practice therapy, I'm quite practical, and we talk a lot about little things that can be done outside of therapy. And one thing that people don't do enough of when they're trying something new or something outside of their comfort zone is they either don't measure their progress, or they don't measure their progress with enough humility. And both of those mistakes means you're not going to get all that positive emotion from seeing that you're actually getting closer to your goal. So if you're trying to stop smoking, you should have some measurement well, I think so one mistake people might make, for example, if they're trying to quit smoking cigarettes or drinking alcohol, is they'll count the absolute amount of days that they haven't smoked or drank. And then what happens when they relapse, which can happen, is they start the counter back to zero. But what I tell people to do is to measure frequency. So let's say January 1st comes and you've stopped smoking or stopped drinking, and let's say you have a relapse on January 22nd. Let's say you smoke one cigarette or have one drink. You could measure it in an absolute sense and say you now go back to zero. But that's not very helpful. But if you just measured it in frequency and said, listen, in the past 22 days, I've only had one cigarette or one drink,
Right.
I've made huge progress, and you can then derive a lot of positive emotion from that, which can help you keep going.
I think that's a very good strategy. And frequentist approaches in general, I think, are better for human minds than categorical kinds of things. But isn't it fascinating that people who are depressed are, not rational? I mean, they're not objective about their own abilities. They, as Aaron Beck talked about, they have negative views of themselves and the future and the like. So why is that? What good could it possibly be to have pessimistic views? But then you have to think about,
Well, now it doesn't make sense, but now because our world is so comparatively safe.
yes, yes.
But our world wasn't always safe.
So my ancestors for the past 1,000 years have lived on a little island off the coast of Norway, and they're not a group who are happy all the time. And I think there's a good reason. I mean, I sometimes imagine one of my ancestors being very enthusiastic in the middle of February and saying, it might be snow, it might be very cold out there, but I'm going to go out and get food anyhow. Well,
yeah,
some of those people never came back again. Their genes were gone. The people who instead just stayed indoors and tried to keep warm and didn't do very much during those long, dark winters, they did better than those who were very enthusiastic. Yeah, I think your point is so important, Alex. Life is different now. We can almost always have enough food, and there are always opportunities. They're all around us constantly, especially now that we have Zoom and the internet and the like. But I think in ancestral times, there were a lot of times when there really wasn't much of anything you could do that would pay off. And in those times, that was in the middle of winter in the north or in the middle of the dry season in the south, there would be times when it would be best to do nothing, just to conserve energy. And in that situation, pessimism is useful.
mm-hmm. And we have when we're walking around with the same pessimistic lens in a radically different environment.
Right. There's one other thing you mentioned that I wanted to comment on, and that is what's called the opponent process. Have you ever noticed that after a grand success, you succeed at something better than you ever thought you could have, and then the next day or the next 2 days, you start feeling low? Isn't it fascinating? I mean, you should feel great. Hey, I've just succeeded. I got my paper accepted. I got a new job. I got, this girl's going to date me. How come people start feeling low after that? And I think there might be a very good reason for that. It is that, to keep that system stable, it's necessary once it starts going off in a positive way to damp it down some so it doesn't spiral out of control. And it does spiral out of control in people with manic depressive illness. I mean, they get some success, and that leads them to great energy, great confidence, great optimism, and they start doing more and more things and staying up all night, and it leads to disaster.
Yeah, people don't. I think something I've started talking about on the podcast about more recently that I think people are reluctant to talk about is just the fact that success in its own weird little way is kind of really stressful, especially when, as you've mentioned, the idea of unexpected success, unexpected progress. It's fun to experience, but at the same time it feels a little overwhelming.
Well, especially if the success is a social success and an increase in social status and the like, because as soon as you go up a rank in status, there's a lot more people trying to drag you down. Envy is a very
and you have more responsibility,
and maybe you will fail. I mean, how many people that we see in even ourselves, we feel like we're frauds. We feel like, oh, I'm not really able to do this, and I'm tricking people and I'm tricking myself, and like, what a terrible feeling. Instead of enjoying your success, feeling like you're an imposter syndrome.
Yeah, and I think that feeling is kind of born from this unconscious sentiment. This is pure speculation on my part. I think it's born from this unconscious sentiment we have that successful people are somehow fundamentally different from us, that they're cut from a different cloth. And so when we reach these points ourselves, you graduate from medical school, or you start your career, or you buy a house, or whatever the thing is, you feel, well, I'm not cut from a different cloth, therefore I must be fake in some way.
Right, right. Yes, and this comes to the basic reality of status hierarchies in humans are not the same as in chickens. And fortunately for we humans, when there's not just one hierarchy in one group, especially in modern life, we all are in many, many different groups. We can be in a church, we can be in a neighborhood group, we can be in a work group, we can be in a sports group, we can be just with a group of friends. And I think one of the most marvelous things about humans is that we can find other people who are real friends who aren't valuing us for what we are and what we offer. They're valuing us for ourselves, and that makes life possible and worthwhile and secure for many people.
Yeah, so the wonderful thing about being human is you get to pick whatever status hierarchy floats your boat and get kind of a situational confidence from that. And then you get to make friends with someone who's in a different status hierarchy. You guys aren't competing, so you can just like each other because you like each other and appreciate each other without necessarily being in overt competition with each other.
That's exactly right. Now, I think people really crave social groups that are not, viciously competitive. I think this is one of the wonderful things that religious groups offer to people, because in many of those groups, it's really forbidden to do status competition kind of things. That people are supposed to appreciate each other for who they are, and I think that's immensely valuable to people.
Mm-hmm. One thing I wanted to touch on with you is the phenomenon of gambling addiction. So gambling is something I think that is widely misunderstood. And when I talk about gambling, I like to point out that gambling it's such a deep vulnerability we have as mammals that you could get a mouse addicted to gambling. And that's called, because I learned this in the beginning of my psych training, and that's called variable ratio conditioning, which basically means if you can pair a reward with an action, so you give a mouse a pellet when they push on a lever, but you do it in a variable ratio, which means you do it in a way that's kind of unpredictable. They don't know when it's going to come, and then you get the ratio just right. They get the most dopamine release in their reward center, and they're the most motivated to do it. So that seems to be the essence of gambling. Why do we have that vulnerability?
Well, again, there are huge individual differences in people's vulnerability to gambling and their vulnerability to addiction to drugs and the like. And I worked with Kent Berridge, who's the world's expert on liking and wanting and the origins of motivation. He takes an evolutionary and a neuroscience view of motivation. And we wrote an article years ago about the origins of addiction, published it in Science. And the simple principle is that drugs of abuse basically hijack the learning mechanism and take over and force the person to keep doing whatever gets them the drugs again. And likewise, gambling and the big win also takes over those mechanisms and gets the person to keep gambling even when they realize it's bad for their life. And I think this goes back to the inherent bias towards optimism that people have. And we also remember wins, big wins, more than loses. But again, some people do. Outgoing people and the like tend to remember their wins and forget their losses. People who are more negative and neurotic tend to remember their losses and not to remember their wins quite so much. And I think in general, those people are less vulnerable to getting trapped into gambling and the like. I've often said that we need to study this particular kind of vulnerability to both gambling and drug use in an evolutionary way. And how do these people differ in the natural environment where there isn't any gambling, where there aren't any drugs available? I mean, I think they would forage differently. They would go out looking for food in different ways. The people who are into gambling are going to be, they get certain cues get to be very salient, because that's what dopamine does. It mainly makes cues more salient and takes over the learning mechanism.
So do you think, and if I'm not mistaken, men are far more predisposed to being addicted to gambling than women?
Yeah.
And so do you think people with a brain predisposed to gambling in a natural environment would seek, let's say, high risk, high reward means of getting food, as opposed to a more, let's say, that'd be more of a hunter than a gatherer? That's a bit of a
You know,
simplification, but
you just spurred an idea that I've never had, and I think it's a very good idea, Alex. So maybe the fundamental differences in foraging that characterize human ancestral groups, in general, I mean, there are exceptions, but in general, men did more hunting, big, big, risky pursuit of larger prey, and women did more foraging, more reliable source of most calories for most groups. That's a very interesting idea, Alex. I think you should write a paper about that.
yeah, or maybe I'll just do a podcast on it.
No, I think that really should be pursued, because other people have talked about mating strategies as the explanation for why men take more risks, because women tend to be attracted to men who take risks and who are very ambitious, and that's a pretty easy explanation for. So Dan Kruger and I did a project years ago looking at why men die sooner than women. You're probably aware, and if you're not, you will be soon, that on the average, men die at about 6 or 7 years younger than women. And we asked, well, why is that? And the evolutionary explanation that we propose is that men, and not just in humans, but in other species too, males, tend to get a larger payoff from more aggressive competitive action early in life, instead of putting their efforts into preserving themselves for the long term. For females, they're not competing for mates in the same intense way, and they continue to be very especially valuable by providing for offspring even after they stop reproduction. So we did a study looking at the rates of death at different ages, and we got data from the World Health Organization and others looking at ages of death, or rates of death at different ages. And again, this is one of those things where I looked at the data and I couldn't believe it, Alex. I'm going to play a guessing game with you for a second. In the UK today, for men and women age 20, for every 100 women who die, how many men do you think will die?
300.
Oh, you're cheating. That's exactly the right answer.
That's incredible.
But when I went into this project, I thought it might be in 120 or something like that. But 3 times as many men die in early adulthood in modern cultures as women. Now,
And that's explained primarily by like crime, suicide, things of that nature.
So we looked, and of the 20 leading causes of death, 19 are higher for men across ages. And we looked at different ages. The difference peaks at peak reproduction age 20 to 30. By the time you get, when does it get equal again? About age 85. So all through the, and even very interesting, and support for our thesis is that even before puberty, males are more likely to die than females. I mean, natural selection has shaped male sexes to put more energy into vigor and competition and the like, and less into preserving tissues for longer term.
Yeah, we're clearly the more disposable gender men.
And I live in Arizona in the winters, and in the Grand Canyon, every year some people fall into the Grand Canyon and die. It's 2 to 1, men versus women. And then you go to ski resorts in the Western U.S. There's a whole special kind of skiing called super reckless skiing, and stunt skiing, and the guys jump off 100-foot cliffs, and they ski right next to avalanche zones, and you do this wild, reckless kind of things. It's very exciting to watch, and women love watching those guys. And guess what? The people who die in skiing accidents every year are many times more likely to be male than female.
And one thing I was curious about is, so all of these evolutionary principles you've learned throughout your career, are these things that you apply in your own life to manage your own mental health, your own personal difficulties?
One tries, but it's hard. And I mentioned before about understanding that our impulses, whether they're sexual or competitive or status or other kinds of things, are just things they're just tricks natural selection is playing on us to try to get us to do things good for our genes. You can tell yourself that, and it can make you take a little bit of a sense of humor towards yourself, which helps a lot, but it doesn't really change things. Or if somebody betrays you and you're angry at them, you can tell yourself, well, this is not doing me any good. This is a natural reaction. You still feel the same way. I do think that trying to understand one's own motives, though, and trying to understand whether you're in a situation where you're pursuing an unreachable goal, that that can be really helpful, although it's even more helpful to talk to somebody else about it, either a friend or psychotherapist. And that's a lot of what we do. We're constantly talking to our friends about our challenges and opportunities, and we're trying to figure out, what makes sense for where I should put my life's energy now.
Yeah. And I think there's a lot to be learned about observing your desires and then observing what happens when your desires are attained. And I feel like this can be a useful filter for which desires should take priority in our lives and which desires are more meaningful. Because there are some desires that once you immediately after you attain them, you're like, that was dumb. Like immediately after you have pizza and ice cream, you're like, this was empty. This was a low nutrition. This was a hollow desire. But after accomplishing something big, you might have that dip in mood, which you mentioned. But it's also true that if you accomplish something meaningful, you can get a deep sense of satisfaction and you can be proud of yourself. So I think there's a real value in like auditing that. I mean, like, what are the things that what are the desires which when I've pulled on their thread led to something, to a deeper sense of meaning and not.
So if you look in my book about good reasons for bad feelings, there's a specific way of trying to do this kind of assessment, and that's the review of social systems. And for each of the six major different kinds of goals in life, you try to ask yourself, or you ask with your therapist, what am I trying to do? How is it going? How is it likely to come out? And what kind of feelings am I have? And we have an acronym for that, SOCIAL, the six different areas of life. S stands for social resources, friends and status in social groups. O stands for occupation and things that other people value that we're doing. C stands for children and family, greatest sources of security and joy for most of us. I stands for income and financial resources. A stands for appearance and abilities and health and personal resources. And finally, L is for love and sex, which of course are not always the same thing. So going through all of those six of those, it takes about 40 minutes to discuss all those with someone. And it needs to be done delicately, I think, because one of the wonderful things about the human mind is that it stops thinking about things that you don't have, and really calling a lot of attention to things that people don't have and could want. That's not useful. So I think this is not something to be done crudely. It really needs time and sensitivity.
Absolutely. Is there anything you're working on now which you're excited to share, something that maybe is going to come out in the future?
My current work now is trying to understand more broadly how we understand the body. And I've just finished a symposium at the International Society for Evolution Medicine and Public Health called "The Body is Not a Machine." That is, complexity in organic evolved systems is fundamentally different from the kinds of complexity in design systems. And this is a mistake that's being made throughout biology and medicine. And our group is going to publish a series of papers trying to encourage people to accept the organic complexity of the systems in the brain and the body, and realize that they can't be described in simple terms that we would like to use to describe them. This has a lot to do with neuroscience. Much of my early work was looking for neuroendocrine causes of anxiety and responses to anxiety. And back then we were trying to say, well, noradrenaline does this and serotonin does that. And a lot of neuroscientists are still saying the anterior cingulate does this and the frontal cortex does that. And yes, there are generalizations you can make, but each function is on all kinds of places in the brain. And serotonin is such a great example. When I was in medical school, I learned that it was regulating the tone of blood vessels. And then as soon as Prozac came out, we learned that Prozac was the neurochemical that influenced mood. But if you actually look at it, there are 20 different serotonin receptors, and they do all kinds of things. Or leptin. Leptin is supposed to be the fat hormone. It turns out that it has at least 42 different functions, depending on what cell it's in and like. We're thinking too simplistically about all of these systems. And where this is all going that's relevant for psychiatry is I think we need to be asking about why some cognitive systems are intrinsically vulnerable to failure. And it's not that there's one, we keep looking for which hormone, which spot in the brain, which gene causes schizophrenia or autism and the like. What if, in fact, these systems are intrinsically vulnerable to failure and any number of changes in that system can make it fail? So this is quite a different perspective, and it doesn't lead you to the kinds of science you can get big funding for, because what we're really saying is instead of looking at where it's broken, let's look at why it's vulnerable to being broken. And there are the 6 reasons we went through before about why anything in the body is vulnerable to being broken. But I think that certain cognitive systems are information systems, and this like systems in the computer, but very different, because in a computer, it's been programmed, and the brain has not been programmed. It's got all of these neurons that are sending electrical impulses that somehow or another get the job done. But all of our attempts in psychology to simplify it, they will never be adequate.
One of the main manifestations of this simplistic way of thinking about things is that we produce drugs where we think we're going to change one thing without affecting a million other things.
Right.
And one new example of this is semaglutide or Ozempic. Have you come across the weight loss drug? Have you read into this? Do you have any thoughts on this?
I'm going to be so interested. I mean, it apparently decreases people's interest in alcohol and drugs in many instances, and we really need to be urgently trying to understand how it changes normal emotions and cognitions. Preliminary reports suggest that some people just kind of lose interest in a lot of things in life, and I'll be fascinated to see those studies come out. They should have been done before we started giving it to millions of people.
How does that happen?
So the best example for that, I think, is the studies that have been done on artificial sweeteners. The Federal Drug Administration here in the States required all kinds of studies about the effects of those things, possibly causing cancer, possibly causing other things. And they almost always did it by injecting them into the veins of rats. And they were shown to be pretty safe. But some artificial sweeteners actually release insulin. Wait a second. You want to be releasing insulin when there's no actual glucose coming into the system? What does that do? And now there's some sweeteners don't release insulin. So you had to test that. You had to actually put the substance not only on the taste buds, but in the stomach, because the stomach has taste receptors for sweetness things. And so again, we're just so naive about the complexity of these systems. And anytime we do something that we think is going to be a simple fix, it doesn't usually work as simply as we think it would.
Which, to be fair, you can argue the desire for a shortcut or a simplistic fix is probably evolution's fault as well, to be fair.
That's a very good point, Alex. And thank goodness we are. I mean, we can be so much more effective now than we were 100 years ago. And even in my career of doing psychiatry for 50 years, gosh, we're way more effective in some ways, but we're not fundamentally more effective, We do psychotherapy, and we're somewhat better at the kinds of psychotherapy we do, especially for anxiety. But and we have drugs that are somewhat more effective, especially in the last 50 years for psychosis, especially. But there have been no giant breakthroughs since the discovery of antidepressants, really, and that's been very discouraging. I have the hope that an evolutionary perspective on what mood is for and how it's normally regulated may lead us to better drugs and other kinds of interventions. I think we can all hope that those understanding why things are the way they are and why they're vulnerable can lead to better treatments.
Absolutely. Well, Dr. Nesse, it's been absolutely wonderful to speak to you. Thank you so much for coming on. I really enjoyed the conversation. I look forward to see how your work goes, and I'd be happy to have you back on to discuss it.
And there's lots more we could talk about. We never talked about OCD or psychosis or ADHD or autism. There are all kinds of things to talk about. For those who are interested listeners, they should just look me up on Google, and most of my papers and lots of other videos and podcasts are on my website. And I'd love to hear from people who are interested in these things.
Perfect. I'll put the links in the description.
Thanks very much. It was a very interesting conversation.
Thanks so much for listening this week. If you've got any feedback, as always, do get in touch. If you enjoyed the episode, why not give us a rating on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, because it really helps other people to find us. If you want to get in touch, you can find us on Instagram or Twitter, or you can drop us an email. And if you value the show more generally, why not buy us a coffee just to help keep us going? Thanks so much.